So we sort of had something going before lunch. Can anybody remember what it was?
Oh, well, I had a question.
It was these hallucinogenic snuffs used by the Yanomami.
Yeah, and hadn't we done that? We've done that. Let's not do that again.
Are you still doing questions?
Sure, yeah.
I got one I'd like to toss around. The whole idea of the shaman as having this hyperdimensional overview, and as you say, some of them say, it scares me shitless, even the top dog. Okay? And other times you said you wonder why it isn't in headlines 11 inches tall. There seems to be something about the experience that is, I don't know if self-selecting is the right word, or evolutionary selecting. Why is there such a small percentage of people who actually end up, although you say everyone can do it, they do have the genetic possibility, but there's something more in the selective period that where a shaman will come out, because it is, as you say, an awesome responsibility, and yet it's everyone's possible liberation. And then one last thing, another coda to this. You mentioned that you don't think that it's the Bush or Reagan, etc., feeling that they just want to keep an economic grip as far as the sale of would-be hallucinogenics. Don't you think that there is some degree of teleological repression going on as well? I mean, you mentioned that you didn't feel that way, but I somehow, other times I've heard you feel that there definitely is.
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, it simplifies the issue to say that it's entirely a money issue.
Right.
Because the psychedelics are used by so small
right.
a percentage of people that it doesn't rate the tremendous institutional fury that is brought against it, and where you really see the contradiction in economic logic is with pot. I think that the subtext of the government's fear about psychedelics is that this quality that they have of dissolving boundaries causes people to question basic assumptions about how society is run. And I think this is true of any society. It isn't an American phenomenon. It's that if you take psychedelics, whatever you are, you know, Eskimo, Hasidic rabbi, quantum physicist, you will question your first premises. And you get millions of people questioning the first premises, and then the powers that be become very nervous. It's interesting that this whole phenomenon of the 1960s occurred because American commitment to universal public education brought its first generation of people to adulthood in the middle of the 1960s, because that universal commitment to public education began after World War II. After the establishment took a look at what this filling, actually funding and building up great public universities and then filling them with inquisitive young people, what the result of that was, that's when they decided to turn the universities back into trade schools for CPAs, which they did do. I mean, there is nothing like the level and the breadth of education and intellectual curiosity that was encouraged when I was going to school. That's all finished now. Now you're expected to do your data entry job, watch a lot of TV, and keep your mouth shut. And this is what we expect of our college graduates. So really there was a crisis of faith in American institutions, which was only exacerbated by psychedelics. It was a combination of educating people to the actual traditions of Western civilization in large numbers for the first time, and then giving them psychedelics, or having them exposed to psychedelics, and people began to ask questions for which there were no answers, and the response of the establishment was to suppress this. I mentioned cannabis. You're all probably aware through the work of the hemp people that cannabis holds many benefits, not necessarily related to its properties as an intoxicant, but as a source of food, lubricant, plastics, fuels, etc. The reason the establishment is so hysterical on the subject of cannabis is because it erodes loyalty to the industrial state. That's why, if you look at the pharmacological profile, let's contrast two familiar drugs. One, caffeine. We have the medical data which shows that it can contribute to fetal malformation. We know that it damages the liver. We know that it, if abused, can cause severe stomach ulcers, so forth and so on. Cannabis, and vast amounts of money have been spent trying to find something wrong with it, and they're still digging, folks. They've decided it doesn't cause tits on statues. It doesn't, all the screwy things they've come up with over the years have had to be abandoned. Why is caffeine enshrined in every labor contract negotiated in the Western world as a sacred right of all workers twice daily? And why is cannabis, you can lose your house, your automobile, your bank account, your art collection, simply because you had 6 plants in the back 40, and your children. Why this disparity? Well, what is the effect of caffeine? It makes it possible for you to perform your duties during the last 3 hours of the work cycle with efficiency equal to the first 3 hours of the work cycle. It allows people to tolerate spinning widgets onto Gombergs until hell freezes over without a thought ever rising in their mind that maybe this is a ridiculous way to spend your life. Cannabis, on the other hand, people aren't so interested in going to work. They'd rather lay around and make love. They don't want to watch TV. They'd rather smoke a doobie and have a conversation with a friend. In other words, these things promote activities which don't make anybody any money and cause people to question the institutions and the social philosophies that are being shoved down their throats. If the playing field were level, caffeine might well be a prescription drug, not that I think that's a good idea, and cannabis, I think, would probably be freely available. The most dangerous drugs in society in terms of detrimental social impact are alcohol and tobacco, the two most freely available. Every street corner of every city, they're peddled in vast amounts. We have a very crack-brained approach to the problem of drugs. We're not the only society. All societies seem to do this. Out of a possible spectrum of 20 or 30 depressants and intoxicants, most societies select 3 or 4 which they hail as harmless, and then the rest are, the seed of Satan. And this attitude is persevered in against all scientific data, against all medical research. This is just what people choose to think. The problem is we don't have the luxury of this kind of ignorance anymore. The amount of revenue that could be accrued from cannabis economy, the pressure that could be taken off petroleum extraction if cannabis were part of the picture, all of these things make it incumbent upon us, I think, to think more creatively and more honestly about which drugs really are posing problems for us. What was the first part?
The other question really relates to this is, why are there, given the fact, why is the percentage of shamans so small relative to a population? Because of the fact that, as you say, there's fear in going into, there's attraction and fear in going into these other realms. And there's obviously maybe some self-limiting aspect of the hyper-dimensional view, which there's some dynamic going on, because everyone has an equal opportunity to go to this hyper-dimensional, but very few of their own initiative really push to that point where you are definitely within the hyperdimensional realm.
Well, there are different things to be said about this. I mean, first of all, there are what are called biochemical differences in individuality, and never more so than in the matter of drugs. People are very different from each other. Years ago, I took a course from Sasha Shulgin at Cal, and at one point he brought in some substance, I don't know what it was, and this was a class of 600 people, and passed it around and asked everybody to take a sniff of this bottle. Well, 598 people pronounced this stuff completely odorless. 2 people were almost violently ill from the overpowering odor of this thing. They possessed a gene for the sensitivity to this compound that caused it to be, for them, overwhelming, for everyone else, unnoticeable. And we're surrounded by these kinds of individual biochemical differences. In traditional societies, shamanism is often a family business, and it may well be that this is because ability to handle these psychedelic substances and to really get mileage out of them is a genetic endowment of some sort. I mean, cannabis, again, it provides an interesting example. One of the commonest things you hear people say about cannabis who don't smoke it is they say, I used to, or I tried it, but it makes me paranoid. To the people who use it, this is inconceivable. In fact, it's almost an antidote to paranoia, because it seems to make things appear more Taoistic, more integrated. It all makes more sense. These are biochemical differences that need to be studied. You know, different racial groups have different relationships to intoxication. I mean, I think there is some truth to the idea that the North American Indians had a susceptibility to distilled alcohol that the Europeans, who had been dealing with it for a couple of centuries by the time they arrived here, didn't have, because the North American Indians represented a closed gene pool, never having been exposed to this. There was no selection for being able to handle it. And then there's another issue in relation to your question, John, which is, first of all, you know, some people say, well, not all shamans take hallucinogens. Well, true, and I've excited some people's ire by suggesting, but all real shamans do. And, you know, saying that somebody is a shaman, I mean, imagine if simply being able to rave and exhort on the subject of the 4 Gospels qualified you as a man of the Lord. Actually, you have to sort through dozens of so-called preachers to find somebody you would be willing to leave alone with your chickens. Well, similarly, you have to sort through a lot of people who claim to be shamans before you find somebody who really is one. I mean, we tend to be naive. Go to the Amazon with your heart on your sleeve seeking ayahuasca, and I guarantee, unless you go well connected, you'll drink a lot of swill before you get to somebody honest enough, responsible enough, conscientious enough to actually make it right and do it right. And in the case of shamanism, usually this is going on in cultures without literacy, without written languages, and so they don't hold conferences or publish proceedings or have the university matriculation examinations in shamanism. So on the surface, a shaman is anyone who claims to be a shaman or who cares to claim. But in terms of real shamanic ability, I think it only comes through either innate special abilities, which probably means innate high sensitivity to neurological to neurotransmitters, exotic neurotransmitters, or it comes through an exposure to hallucinogens. This is a big argument in anthropology. Mircea Eliade, who normally I am very deferent to, got this one completely wrong and decided on absolutely no evidence that what he called narcotic shamanism was decadent. Well, first of all, the use of the word narcotic in that context shows that he didn't know what he was talking about. Nobody uses narcotics to shamanize. You go to sleep if you take narcotics. So what he wanted to say was that he felt hallucinogenic shamanism was decadent, but what is the alternative? Reliance on ordeals, fasting, or pathological personalities, maybe epileptics or borderline schizophrenics or something like that. I think that these kinds of shamanisms that are not hallucinogenically based are derivative shamanisms that occur at a later stage of culture when the plant-based shamanism has been disrupted by some factor like migration or the disappearance of the plants involved or something like that. Yeah.
From what I understand, the Lakota Indians didn't use hallucinogenics. They accomplished all of this through, the drum beat and the song and things like that. And to this day, if you talk to the Lakota about the use of hallucinogenics as far as their shamans go, they say it's not necessary. And yet in the Southwest, it's prominent.
Yeah, well,
right
I think acoustical driving can carry you a certain distance. There are substitutes for hallucinogens, but they're neither as effective nor as pleasant. I mean, ordeals are what many cultures get into.
Well, I was just thinking, along the lines of, someone like Crazy Horse who came out from Lakota who seemed to possess these, abilities and manifest them physically.
Well, there's also the exceptional personality. The exceptional personality breaks all the rules, see. But, something I wanted to say.
So would you say then, Terence, that there is a genetic proclivity, maybe in some individuals, if there is access to botanicals, and if there is no historical evidence of shamanism prior to that, for that individual to start engaging in explorations?
Yeah, I think so. Maria Sabina claimed that she was never initiated into shamanism. She claimed that as a girl herding the cattle, she ate the mushrooms because she was hungry, and that she was basically self-taught in shamanism in a society that actually had shamanic lineages and institutions. In Madagascar, there are these highly evolved ordeal poisons, and this is where you take a plant, you feel like you're dying, you beg to die, you want to die, and you don't die. You come back from it a better person, but it is only because you were slammed up against death itself. Ordeals work, but they're not very pleasant, and the idea of putting yourself through an ideal like that once a week or twice a month as part of your professional practice is pretty outrageous. The other thing that has to be said, and this is really important, and I think anthropologists have sold this one short, experiences are what we are least able to communicate to each other. We can describe machine parts, agricultural procedures, but anything in the realm of feeling, our languages are woefully impoverished, and I don't think that's specific to English. I think it haunts all human experience, that it's hard to communicate how we feel. Well, so then there's a vast spectrum of experiences that come from plants, and I dare say most of them unpleasant. Let's start out with eating Dieffenbachia or something, which causes your throat tissues to swell up and you feel like you're strangling. Or, Amanita muscaria is a very controversial shamanic plant because some people say it's garbage, and Gordon Wasson in his last book called it the supreme entheogen of all time. Well, clearly people are they talking about different things, or are they interpreting the same experience differently? And so there are, for example, people who are fond of peyote, like, if they haven't done their homework, like to imagine that they are taking this ancient hallucinogen that has informed the lives of the Sonoran and the Indians of that area for thousands and thousands of years. Well, this is, as far as anybody can tell, complete bunk. There is no record of peyote use older than 400 or 500 years. Most of it is post-ghost dance. When you go into the old Sonoran graves, the old archaeology of the Sonoran, the Tarahumara Indians, you find Socorus secundifolia beans, the little black and red beans that you see in Mexico strung into jewelry sold along the side of the roads. That's what those Indians took for thousands and thousands of years. We have a continuous record over about 4,000 years of these seeds being buried in graves with ritual instruments indicating that they were buried with shamans. You couldn't give it away today because it is such a horrible experience. It's essentially sublethal strychnine poisoning. It can kill you effortlessly. It's clear that at some point, fairly recently, somebody tried peyote and said, my God, this stuff we've been taking for thousands and thousands of years is just horrible compared to this. This is great. And immediately there was a transfer of loyalty. And Lord knows, eating fresh peyote is no gourmet undertaking. So the point there being, cultures tend to define experiences differently, and you can't tell what people are talking about until you really check in. Traveling around the world, you end up in certain cultures, and they say, "Oh, we're so happy to have you here. As our honored guest, we would like you to eat some of our national food." Let's say you're in Scotland, and so they say, "Well, you must eat some haggis, because this is what we all eat. We all really love this. This is the best part of Scottish life. Boy, are you going to love this." Well, when it's finally served, your jaw drops in disbelief because it's ghastly, unless you're Scotch. And well, but if you're Scotch, you dare not say so, you see, because a cultural myth has been built up around. I mean, do Italians knock red wine? Do the French denounce truffles? Certainly not.
You know the origin of Scotch.
True. Pâté de foie gras is always my example of it. So what you have to realize is that these things are culturally defined, and often what works for the Yanomamo or the Muinani or the Witoto won't work for you. Datura is a good example. Datura is a shamanic plant used by many people throughout the world. All of them, I think, pharmacologically deprived. Otherwise, they wouldn't put up with what you have to put up with to take that stuff, And my interest, and it was practical, was to find a hallucinogen that did what I wanted it to do and didn't do anything I didn't want it to do. What I was interested in was, first of all, hallucinations, because some people say I'm obsessed with it. Fine. My notion is that if you can see something that isn't there, that's very much more convincing than just funny thoughts, racing ideas, strange physical sensations. It's a powerful and boundary-dissolving confrontation when you confront what is not there. And so I find, and this is a heresy for sure, I'm not that fond of LSD. I think it's a very sloppy drug. I think, you feel terrible the next day. I always did. I had tight headaches, body ache. People always say, well, it was not clean, it had speed in it, it had strychnine in it. Maybe. But even the good stuff is not, and it wouldn't hallucinate for me the way I wanted it to. I could get hallucinations if I would smoke hash with it, but on its own, it was what I have described in other places as abrasively psychoanalytic, unpleasant, confrontational, and what I was interested in were hallucinations. So when I got to psilocybin, I remember after my first mushroom trip, I said, thank God we found this stuff. I'll never take LSD again. That wasn't quite true, but I'll bet I've taken it less than half a dozen times since my first psilocybin trip. So, and in terms of the chemistry of these things, my conclusion from all this fiddling is that it's the indole hallucinogens that are at the center of the mandala. They do what we want them to do with very little detrimental side effects. LSD is one of them. Ibogaine is one of them, not one widely known. We got to save something for our old age, folks. Harmine and harmaline, the beta-carbolines, when complexed with DMT, and then psilocybin, and I think that's the basic list. Well, those these are really the keys which open the lock very easily, very cleanly, very dependably. And that's where I would put all of my attention. And, you know, even in that domain, you have to be somewhat careful. My brother and I spent years tracking down a hallucinogen in the Amazon called ukuhe that was an orally active form of DMT, which remember I said that DMT is destroyed in the gut. So we were fascinated to try and find this ukuhe because we wanted to know how it was possible that it could work orally. And also the ethnographic accounts claimed that the people who used it spoke with little men. And we wanted to see these little men, to see if they were the same little men we were trying to. Well, we had 3 expeditions to the Amazon before we finally closed in on this stuff. And when we finally got it, you know, with this tremendous sense of having attained the Grail and having finally, this was going to do it, this was going to be the one, then we took this stuff, and my God, it turned us every way but loose. Your heart feels like it's pounding its way out of the front of your chest. You vomit. You have tremoring of the limbs, on and on and on. So we go through this, live through it, wash off in the river and go looking for the shaman to lodge a complaint. And he says, yeah, well, it's hard to get used to. And so then when we get it back home to the lab and do the high-pressure gas chromatography and all the rest of it and see what's really there, you see that the genetic component of the Varroa trees from which this resin is extracted it's a mess. It's too many tryptamines. DMT, DET, 5-monomethyltryptamine, 5-MAO DMT, and several other cardioactive tryptamines. It looked like they'd swept the floor of an Indo chemist's lab to put together the components of this plant. You don't want this. You don't, because it's like taking 10 drugs at once. You know, it's all running together. You can't tell whether you're Agnes or Angus. What you want is a DMT source where when you put it in the gas chromatograph, you get one spike, that's N-dimethyltryptamine, and all the rest is cellulose, a little DNA, and that's all, some minerals and salt. If you don't have a clean source, then, you know, it's contaminated. So even that legendary shamanic hallucinogen, when actually put to the use test, wasn't able to pass it. Yeah.
Yes, going back to the DMT and mushroom psilocybin, you were talking about taking psilocybin and then doing breath control is indistinguishable from a DMT trip. If you do it correctly, you can coax it. Since this is a learning tree and you're sort of in front there, maybe you could give us an idea of what it's like to coax 5 grams into an... I mean, I'm sure you won't be able to give us all the information, but maybe you can sort of enlighten us a little bit and we can sort of work in that direction. At least I can work in that direction.
Oh, you mean how do you get at the peak of a psilocybin trip to deliver you into DMT land?
Yes, because sometimes I get a little jealous hearing you talk about DMT trip, and I sit here and say, you know, I want to find that stuff, and you know, anyway, so.
Well, the thing is, psilocybin will take you there if you have the courage and the stamina to tolerate the duration of the psilocybin revelation.
Thank you.
First of all, you take a heroic dose, 5, 6, 7 grams. Then, when you're peaking, you smoke cannabis. Then, you sit in silent darkness, alone, because I think the presence of other people always pins you to the surface with this stuff. I mean, you don't need somebody else there.
No matter if they're talking or not, they can just be in the room and you're aware of them.
Just sitting there, then this is a different thing.
Yeah.
Breathing, exhaling, breathing, exhaling, and then you form an intention for it to approach you. I mean, you say, I can feel it. I mean, it's almost it's a neighborhood. It's a pharmacological neighborhood. And you know how you may go to Little Italy, but there are no Italians on the street. But if you start, you have to somehow shake them out of the nest. And you simply ask for them to appear. I always hark back to that episode of I Love Lucy where she and Ethel are discussing how to contact the space people. And Lucy tells Ethel, she says, well, I just say, come in, little green man, come in, little green man. And yeah, it's a big laugh now, but try it on 25 milligrams of psilocybin.
Plus, I'd be great to know what your view at this point is of the whole UFO and contact team. I'm not sure which of those questions comes first.
Well, the they of the DMT thing is these entities which you contact, although they may turn out to be toys created by someone unseen who is in fact in charge of this hyperdimensional maternity ward. But these toys, if that's what they are essentially teaching machines of some sort. They're trying to get you to perform this linguistic activity. As far as the UFO thing is concerned, I think it's it sort of requires some backgrounding. I think that there's something fundamentally wrong with our understanding of the world. Fundamentally wrong. And what it is that we believe that the past creates the present. That the present is the sum total of actions and situations that exist in the past. In other words, we believe that the horse pushes the cart. The horse doesn't push the cart. The cart is pulled. There is an attractor in the future. There is actually, I think of history as a bowl down whose slope we are making our way. Well, since we are in a situation where conservation of energy is important, where are we all going to end up? The bottom of the bowl, obviously. That's, if you release a marble up on the rim, it's going to make its way down the bowl to what's called the dwell point, the place where the energy requirements are such that the forward momentum of the falling ball is satisfied by meeting the resistance of the bottom of the bowl. History is like this. We are being pulled forward by an attractor. It has somehow come into the human world and has pulled us out of animal organization. If this attractor were not present, we would still probably be cheerfully slinging excrement around in the canopy of some jungle tree. But because of the attractor, we have been pulled into social organization, technology, language, community, so forth and so on. And mystics and seers and visionaries are people who have a relationship to this attractor that is different from the rest of us. They can glimpse aspects of this thing. And when I think of it this way, I always think of those the mirrored ball that they hang over the bar in a disco, and then they spin it and it throws reflections of light all over the room from the ambient lighting. Well, history is like this. The attractor at the end of time, which is below the event horizon of the present and thus impossible to anticipate its true form, sends back through time distorted reflections of itself, which, if you are struck by one of these distorted reflections, well, then you begin to preach and cure, and local conditions may damp your activity, and then you're what's called a nut. But if, in fact, local conditions support your activity so that you become a meme spreader, then you're suddenly a Messiah, a teacher, a Buddha, a Christ, a Mohammed. That's what these people were. They were people who were, for reasons mysterious to themselves, I'm sure, in a relationship of resonance with the transcendental object, such that they, in a sense, embodied it. Well, in our own era, because of technology, and Jung was on to this when he wrote his book in 1948 called Flying Saucers, A Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. He said, the flying saucer is an image of the self that haunts the skies of Earth as a compensatory effect to our alienation. Well, I think that that's exactly what's going on, except that he didn't realize how nuts and bolts that explanation was. The UFO is a mirage being cast backward into time by the transcendental object at the end of time. And that's why it has such a hair-raising aura of weirdness about it. It isn't a ship from another star system. I mean, how could anyone reasonably entertain that idea, given the distances in time and what you find when you get here? I mean, who would make that trip who had any reasonable way to spend their time? It's a compensatory image that haunts time, because time is a kind of hologram. Time is a fractal. And fractal means that the same pattern is embedded again and again in a relationship of self-similarity. So, because the transcendental object exists somewhere ahead of us in history, there must necessarily be a tiny part of it somewhere nearby. And this is what the UFO is, I think. And this is why nobody's ever going to show you a chunk of it, and they're never going to put an extraterrestrial on network television, because it isn't that kind of a creature. It's a compensatory image from the end of time. This leads me to an aspect of what I wanted to talk, or what I very briefly and obliquely indicated this morning, which was when I was talking about how we're halfway through history, but the rest of it has to happen in only 30 years. I think that we're moving towards something called concrescence. This isn't my word, it's Alfred North Whitehead's word. I think you can tell what it means. It means everything melts together into one thing. I think that from the very birth of the universe, this is bigger than the human species, bigger than the life of the earth. From the very first moments of the universe's existence, it has been itself under the domain, under the influence of an attractor. And this attractor is pulling everything into tighter and tighter states of self-reflective resonance. And that now we are very close to this concrescent event. And that in fact human history, I called it the shock wave of eschatology, but I didn't talk much about what eschatology is, because, well, first of all, it lies below the event horizon of the present historical epoch, but it won't always. It could rise above the horizon at any time, 2000, 1996, you name it. But we have been too long under the spell of the idea that only the past creates the present. The present is actually largely created by appetite for the future. And this would seem to me a highly improbable idea had I not taken psychedelics and gotten this hyperdimensional view of the system that we're living in. And then you can see that, yes, history is not a random walk. It's not a series of undirected random fluctuations. History is a process of fractal self-complexification that builds on whatever it has achieved. And so upon the complexity of animal organization is laying the complexity of human language. Upon the complexity of human language is laid the complexity of symbolic signification of that language, i.e. writing. Upon writing is laid electronic technology, and so forth and so on. So we are, in a sense, in the act of giving birth to or creating the object of our theologies, which is a kind of god or goddess, depending on, how you slice into it, how you feel about it. And the UFO is simply an indicator that we are so close now to encountering the concrescent transcendental object that it's able to haunt the skies of Earth and the imaginations of people who live in trailer parks. This is, you have to remember that history itself is a violation of the laws of nature, and history and its consequences are all around us. We don't have to argue about whether is history happening. I mean, if obviously it's happening, we're embedded late in it. But it's caused by the fact that ordinary nature, the nature of glaciers, chipmunks, anthills, termite nests, and whale pods, has come, at least in the case of our species, under the influence of something which is literally fastened onto us and is now recreating us in its image. It's taking a monkey body and it's saying, stand it up, slide the eyes around to the front, oppose the thumb, shed the hair, enlarge the brain, put ideas into the brain, so forth and so on. I mean, we are being recast as something unimaginable to the rest of nature. And we are now fairly close to figuring out what this is. This is why we are able to talk about human-machine symbiosis, virtual reality, downloading ourselves to the size of viruses in a nanotechnological domain, stuff like that.
So, you say that the index of compressors, to look at this current version, flap is taken, which has to do with contact human impregnated designation. What's his name at Harvard, the psychiatrist who's active in the book now, a number of people he's worked with who claim to have had fertilization.
Yeah, I agree with your idea that it's an index of the depth of concrescence, though muddied by shrewd public relations types who are making a living off this stuff. I think the crop circles are a more honest indication of how close we are to the transcendental body. I interviewed the person you mentioned at Harvard for a film we did in Prague a few months ago, and
His name was?
I'm avoiding.
Oh.
And I had to ask him halfway through the interview, I said, well, do you detect anything in your own psychological makeup which makes you unfit to be doing this work? That was after he told me that he'd interviewed 500 women who had had fetuses removed from their bodies by space people. And he said, you know, the amazing thing about this is there are no physical scars at all. And I said, well, what does this suggest to you? And he said, advanced surgical techniques of which we have no knowledge. And I'm just, my crap detector went AWOL on that answer. The rules of evidence are not in suspension for the new age. And, you know, people who recall their lifetime as the barber of Nefertiti or whatever have serious problem with what I call the rules of evidence. They don't seem to have ever heard of Occam's razor, which you study logic for 10 minutes and they tell you about Occam's razor. Do you all know what this is? It's a simple idea. Keep it next to you. Hypotheses should not be multiplied without necessity. And there are a lot of unnecessary hypotheses running around, especially in the New Age domain. I would study the impregnation effect more as an example of mass hysteria because, you know, being in the position that I am in, supposedly a revered teacher and a person of great insight and all this hoopla and crapola, you occasionally get invited to dinner with the movers and shakers, and then you hear what's said when not on stage. And I have to tell you, there's enough cynicism to satisfy a Renaissance pope among these people. They are taking the rest of us for a ride in many cases.
Terence, well, Danny and I last night were discussing like what this transcendental object. We were enumerating a list of things that it could possibly be, and as you say, the casted reflection and so forth. How is it that, say, for example, the ayahuasqueros, in Pablo Amaringo's drawings, there's a UFO motif in one of his drawings. What is that?
You mean, do they see UFOs?
What are they? What is it that they see? When is it? Because they specifically identify this motif as separate from the rest of the drawings in one of Shaman's drum magazines.
Well, I'm giving the UFO a slightly different status than this stuff I'm dumping on. I think the UFO is real, or that there is a real phenomenon. The problem is, what is the phenomenon? And it's why someone who sees a spinning disk in the sky assumes then an entire theology about friendly extraterrestrials coming to help us out. Well, why do they assume that? What they've seen is a spinning disk in the sky, for crying out loud. Maybe what they saw was a spinning disk in the sky. There are two phenomena here which are entangled inextricably and unfortunately for the intellectually honest. There's the UFO. Who knows what that is? And then there's the UFO community. And the UFO community is just fraught with the most crack-brained, peculiar, self-serving, unstable, mush-minded group of people you would ever hope to get together in one place. I mean, it's like a magnet for screwballs. I mean, people who like to wear diamond tiaras and give themselves funny names, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the tremendously fascinating and ambiguous phenomenon of strange things seen in the sky. I mean, I went through this, I'm not talking as an outsider. I had a UFO encounter that was a deeper encounter than most of the people who run around pontificating about UFOs. And I will, at the risk of boring you yet again with this story, tell the story. I was in the Amazon. I was having all these revelations about time and one thing and another, and I noticed a place in the sky where there was a spectrogrammatic diffraction of some sort. It wasn't a rainbow, it was a colored smudge in the sky, and I was lightly but continually intoxicated on mushrooms during this period. And it said, "Watch there." It was in the southwest. And I really didn't need to be told, but it said, "Watch there." So I sat up one night, all night, on this rock by a lake, watching the southwest. And around 4:30 in the morning, with essentially a perfectly clear sky, except that off the Amazon jungle, local mist rises, and so about 1.5 miles away from me on the horizon was a line of what looked to me like a little fog bank. And as light broke over this situation, I noticed, I couldn't tell whether it had been doing this or it began doing it as things got lighter, but I noticed that this fog bank was rolling in place, like a pencil rolled between your fingers, which I had never seen a fog do that. I thought, what a strange thing. And as I watched it stretched out across the horizon, it gently broke into 4 equal-sized pieces. So now I'm looking at 4 gray lenticular clouds spaced out along the horizon about 1.5 miles away from me across this lake. So I'm watching, and I'm getting eager, and I'm getting excited. And as I watch these 4 lenticular clouds, 2 and 2 merge. Now I'm looking at 2 denser, grayer, dark gray, darker than storm clouds, these 2 things on the horizon. And as I watch, the 4 became 2, the 2 become 1. And at that point, faintly, I could hear the whee, whee, whee sound of 1950s science fiction UFOs, a la The Day the Earth Stood Still, They Came from Outer Space, so forth and so on. And I see, my God, this thing is starting toward me, and the sound is getting louder. And at that point, there was like a complete conversion in an instant, and my whole body went cold, and I realized they're coming for me. This is it. Prepare to be beamed up, Scotty. And everybody was asleep in a hut about 70 feet up this mud embankment. I was down by the river and the lake, and I said, and it flashed in my mind, I have to get a witness. There must be a witness. And I looked over my shoulder at the mud bank. The thing was coming at me. I half stood up. My knees were so weak. I sat back down, and I just prepared to depart this planet, this dimension. And as it came, I could see it, and it was getting closer and closer. I could see rivets on the underside. I could see the running lights. And as it got closer and closer, I realized that what I was looking at was the end cap of a 1932 Hoover vacuum cleaner. The very end cap that George Adamski had suspended on a piece of nylon thread in his garage and photographed with his Brownie Instamatic to produce the famous UFO photograph of the UFO with the 3 balls on the underside and the ribbing going around, right? That photograph has been utterly debunked. Computer analysis of it by modern techniques, it's bullshit. And there it was, 40 feet in diameter, coming after me across the Amazon treetops. Well, then, and I just went bananas at that point, and then it passed over not more than 200 feet above my head. Turning slowly, I could see the 3 balls, I could see everything. I could see it. And I understood then that what it was more shocking than a real UFO, because it had its disconfirmation built into it. I was having an experience which you couldn't tell anybody about. What would the editor of We Love UFOs magazine say if you told him that story? He'd say, "Get out of here. We don't print stories like that. We're interested in real UFOs."
Did it impart information to you of some sort? Because apparently you've been knighted the person to speak about mushrooms in such a way that you're actually, and some people do say that Terence Mckenna may be an alien being himself incarnate.
Well, only people who are in litigation with me. I think what it was telling me, it was a perfect Zen lesson. It was saying, don't believe in UFOs. They're the end caps of 1932 Hoover vacuum cleaners, expand to 40 feet in diameter and flying through your mind.
So you have to question everything.
Yeah, it's saying, you can't replace one stupid hypothesis, there aren't UFOs, with another stupid hypothesis, we're being visited by benevolent creatures from another world. You have to get a little more depth here if you want to be the alien ambassador. Yeah. Well, the crop circles, I'm now less sure about the crop circles. What I liked about them was that they appeared at a certain point in time, and then each year there were more of them. And I figured that we could take how many there are each year and draw a curve and reach a conclusion about how far away in the future the source of them was. Because if they are, it's almost as though the UFO leaves no trace. I mean, the burn marks on the ground, but already you're into dubiousness, because who has ever seen these burn marks? Only the editors of these UFO magazines and their willing sycophants. I mean, you and I have not seen these burn marks. We've seen photographs of funny stuff on the ground, and we're told that's it. The crop circle leaves a trace that is enduring. But the problem I have with the crop circles, and it's odd how you never hear this discussed, is that nobody has ever seen one come into existence. We get before and we get after, but how come we never get during? Do they appear instantly? If they appear instantly, that would be pretty convincing. Just glance, it's not there. Glance, it's there. You would figure, yeah.
There's the guy who's doing a lot of the research is Colin Andrews. He's doing a lot of research on this, and I've got a recording. This is basically how he described it. They were waiting and setting up in this area to, try and record some of this going on. And this is over in Europe. And all of a sudden, the recorders are running, and all of a sudden they all stand up because there's this incredibly strange, powerful sounding buzz of some kind that comes from far away. It just comes zooming up and comes past them over this little ride that's next to them. Okay? And it takes them all of maybe, 45 seconds or a minute to get to the top of the rise, and they're on the other side of the rise, and the crop circle that wasn't there when they started setting up. So apparently, and Richard Hoagland talks about this too.
Don't get me started.
Okay.
Don't get me started. Bad works of art on a scale of miles are not what we should expect from intelligent visitors from the stars. Here's what isn't it a little weird? First of all, let me say I'm open-minded about the crop circles, but let's also not be silly. Isn't it a little peculiar that this phenomenon appears within driving distance of the apartments of the people most likely to chronicle and proclaim it as a manifestation of telluric energy from another dimension? In other words, what if it had been happening in Turkmenistan? Then you would have something, but then how would John Michel and Colin Andrews and all these people have been able to make a living off of it? There are a number of things that are really weird about the crop circles. First of all, we're talking southern England here. The place is littered with RAF bases, nuclear weapons depots, intercontinental missile delivery systems, so forth and so on, and we're asked to believe that the Ministry of Defense is utterly unconcerned about the fact that the airspace of Great Britain is being violated night after night after night by a mysterious agency that, if it can snap the stem of a wheat stalk, could throw the switch on an electrical device of some sort. The British establishment is utterly unconcerned by the crop circle.
They're not necessarily sure it comes from above. It's coming from under.
Well, but wherever it's coming from, if you had a nuclear weapons depot, I think you would be Johnny at the raffle to find out what's going on.
Didn't you read, like last year, the year before, like these two guys came forward and said that they perpetrated a hoax and something?
Right, and all that did was muddy the waters. Well, it did one good thing. It finished the "it can't be done by human beings" position. We now know, Rupert and all these people, Rupert, believe it or not, is the plant pathologist who serves on the board of the Cereologist, which is the main publication that is booming this. They held a contest in July where you paid £50, you were assigned a 5-acre plot. You had from 10 at night until 4 in the morning. There were, I think, 16 entries. Everybody was given the same design. and at dawn, judges helicoptered over the sites and then made a ground inspection. And 3 of the contestants produced crop circles that were indistinguishable from the real thing. Beautiful crop circles. And I'm getting this from believers. You know, this is what Rupert reluctantly informed me of. I think that, and you know, one theory is that it's a particle beam weapon being tested from space. But tested 750 times in the last 18 months in the same small part of England?
Never covered their tracks.
I don't know. I came up with 2 theories that do not require telluric intervention or friendly extraterrestrials. First theory. A whole lot of people. First of all, it's killed the UFO industry in England. You can't give away UFO sightings at this point. So all of these people, you know, it all is happening near Glastonbury and down where the old earthworks are. It's occurring in an area where there is the largest concentration of people likely to hail it as a paranormal phenomenon on the surface of the earth, and they have done so. They have made outrageous statements. Statements like, no human being could do this, it's impossible to explain this, so forth and so on. Well, now imagine that something like MI5, you know what that is, it's the English CIA, looks at the rise of paganism in Britain, you know, earthworks, channeling, all of this stuff, and says, this threatens church and state. We need to create a disinformation situation. Let's lure these people out onto a limb, way out onto a limb, and then let's cut the limb off. So what you do is you create this pseudo-paranormal phenomenon. You get John Mitchell, Colin Andrews, all these people to proclaim its weirdness, and then you reveal that it's easily duplicated. That's one theory. In other words, the British establishment is undercutting paganism by luring these people into saying too much. But that's not my favorite theory.
Well, that's highly probable. What's your favorite?
Oh, my favorite theory is much better. Because the question is, how do you make these things? When you actually go to the crop circles, what do you see? This is a Sherlock Holmes type deal. You know, Sherlock Holmes could handle the crop circles with his arm tied behind his back, I think. When you go to the crop circles, here it is, the crop circle. Mysterious, unearthly, portending who knows what. And what else is there? Well, the press and the sightseers and yourself and an extraordinary number of Japanese tourists. Now,
economics.
You're getting close. The Japanese press has followed the crop circle phenomenon more avidly than any other press in the world outside of England. Every new crop circle, it appears, photographs and discussion. It is huge in Japan. Japan, they're obsessed with this stuff. I think that what might be going on, this is certainly a lot more likely than extraterrestrials or telluric forces. Do you all know what MITI is? It's the Ministry of Trade and Industry. It's this enormous organization in Japan which coordinates technological development and marketing. It's what we're talking about when we say Japan Incorporated. I think that this is a MIDI research project, and that these Japanese tourists, which are ever present at these sites, some of them are drawn from a centuries-old tradition of ninja stem snappers who, at a given signal, are able to hurl away their Nikons, rush into the corn, and in the matter of a few minutes create these things, then put their cameras back on and their sunglasses back on and take up their deep cover as Japanese tourists. Now, why would MITI do such a thing? What's in it for them? It's a semiotics project. They are studying the impact of symbols on the Western mind. The closest thing to these crop circles, if you look at a complete encyclopedia of them, are the pottery marks made by master potters in medieval Japan on their ceramics. Almost all of the crop circles, except the frivolous ones, like, for instance, how about the fact that the symbol of the Cereologist magazine was done in one